Welcome to our event.
Turn on the mic.
Thank you. Oh, okay. I'll project. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. First, I want to give a thanks to this space, La Peña, which, if those of you who may not know, was founded in 1974 by Chilean revolutionaries. So, you know, this whole space has a big legacy of social justice and has been a home to many movements here in the Bay Area. So, and again, if you're not, we're going to pass around a clipboard right now. So if you don't know about the events here and the other events being, social justice events being sponsored, please get on the mailing list. So this event is sponsored by two organizations. The first one is La Peña Second Generation, which is a new generation of Bay Area folks who have grown up around La Peña, who want to revitalize the space and connect it with contemporary social justice movements. So, you know, it's a really important thing to support the space. And we want to do more events like this, so please sign up on the clipboard that's going around and get on the list so that you can hear about more events. The other organization that is sponsoring this event is Advance the Struggle, which is a Marxist collective in the Bay Area that's trying to build revolutionary consciousness and movements. They've been active in several things that have been going on here, including the Lakeview School sit-in, a lot of like May 1st immigrant rights, and also like foreclosure defense and all of that. So they're a great group also. One note here, though, that this event was originally going to be a fundraiser for the South African miners and their families, but unfortunately, due to circumstances within the country, we're actually not able to get them the money at this time, so we're not going to be collecting money or donations because it's, you know, we just don't have a way to get it to them at this time. But if you are interested in the status of, you know, this particular effort and want to support it in the future, please get in touch with Zach, who will give his email later on, or sign up on the sheet, and we'll probably be able to get you info as soon as we know what's going on. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Gerald. Gerald Smith is a longtime Oakland activist. He was involved in the 1984 to 85 ILWU labor boycott, which was done in solidarity with South African workers fighting apartheid. He is also a founding member of Berkeley Cop Watch and the Oscar Grant Committee Against Police Brutality. So give it up for Gerald.
Thank you very much. Before I begin, because I don't know how many of you actually saw this event, I want to familiarize you with the event that kind of got us going. Go ahead, Zach, give it to him.
Conseguí una de 30 euros.
Okay, 30 men, 34 striking miners were killed in this incident on the 16th of August. Something seems to be wrong in paradise. We're going to examine the history of South Africa because I'm not sure, but it looks like the little dream world that some of these ANC leaders have enveloped themselves in is very quickly coming to an end. right now, we're seeing in South Africa, you should know this, that the day after they massacred these men, the Roman platinum mine owners ordered them back to work. They let it be known to these capitalists, may I say, that they were not going to return to work. They just murdered their families, their brothers, and in fact, they have not been back to work since. This strike has continued. It has grown. The actual strike has grown in the face of this type of massacre. It became clear to me when I found a couple of youngsters didn't know where South Africa was on the map, that it might be worth actually talking about this country with such a rich history of political and social struggle. Now, where do you want to begin? You know, South Africa, you talk about history, we can start talking about Lucy. No, I don't think, nobody's anthropology, no? Okay, good, at least one person. Lucy is the name that they gave to the remains of the oldest of the human being on the planet that they have found. You know, they found these fossils, yeah, in South Africa, and they were identified as the oldest remains that they have in the world of any human being. We can't go back that far, so we're going to start. And I'm going to try to draw some parallels to help you understand this phenomenon of South Africa so that you can better understand the unfolding class struggle today in South Africa. If you look at South Africa's origins very similarly to the United States. The United States started off settlers, came across the ocean, killed up the Indians, took their land, etc., etc. I presume we know this story. But in South Africa, it's quite similar, because actually the Portuguese, early 1600s or even before, arrived in South Africa. They were followed. They actually decided they didn't care for the place very much. They were trying to get to the Far East. You may have heard of Marco Polo and the stories about the diamonds and the rubies and the pearls from the Far East. Well, following them were the Dutch. We had British, French, German, all kinds of people. There was a rush, a scramble for Africa. Over the years, these people, this conglomeration of humanity, began to take on a different fabric. They became an independent people, actually. Pretty much abandoned and left on their own. They started to try to set up farms. You know, at this time in human history, capitalism was still relatively young. And what people wanted, particularly people from places like England, you know, was land. They wanted their own piece of land. Well, there wasn't much of that in England, let me tell you, particularly following the corn laws, etc., where they intentionally proletarianized the population. It was vicious. It was bloody. And Charles Dickens made a whole profession out of writing about the ugliness of emerging capitalism. Tale of Two Cities, etc., etc. Christmas Carol, right? These people in South Africa became known as the Boers. And they were, as I said, a conglomeration of people. Even their language became a kind of it wasn't Dutch, it certainly wasn't German, it wasn't French. It was their own little thing. Now, as they traveled north in South Africa, they set up the Orange Free State, and the Transvaal. But then in 1869, something significant occurred. They discovered near the city of Kimberley diamonds. And let me tell you, that changed people's attitude about South Africa, about this miserable, God-forsaken place. Here come the British. Okay? Later on, after they discovered the diamonds, they had a gold rush around 1886. They discovered gold in the Transvaal, and in 10 years, the city of Johannesburg had 100,000 residents. We talking 1890s. That's a big city, and this is in Africa. Well, now the British knew they wanted this colony to be theirs. Actually, the British first, the full map for a minute, so I can show. Yeah, the British first occupied like the Cape, Eastern Cape, Western Cape, and they went on to dominate the region economically. That is, insofar as factories were set up, they were largely set up by the British, even at this time. Well, they wanted to hold enchilada, to be honest with you, particularly after the diamonds and the gold were discovered. The poor Boers had moved north and north and north, as you can see. Right. You see the Orange Free State and Trent. Very serious. And what basically happened was, there wound up being a war. The first Boer War, believe it or not, these little old Boers smashed the British. The first one. Now, that was 1877. Well, if at first you don't succeed, try and try again. The British wanted that gold. So eventually there was a second Boer War. This was started around 1899, and here you have to stop and think, because the British had a definite edge. Modern weaponry, for instance, that matters when you're fighting a war. A well-trained army. So they defeated the Boers rather quickly, but the Boers didn't give up. They resorted to all types of little guerrilla operations, etc. They continued to try to fight back. And here it's kind of interesting because the British like to, of course, put themselves forward as decent people who respect human rights. But this was one of the first times where you had a real violation of human rights by the British on a massive scale. Understand this. Of course, they were moving in on the Africans. They were, they enslaved them. Then the British freed the slaves. They set up, as we'll go into in a little while, these locations where blacks could be. We'll show you that in 1 second. But to give you a sense of British humanity, by 1902, they finally had defeated the Boers. 26,000 women and children died in the concentration camps run by the British. The world's first concentration camps. So, these Boers went through it. Let's see the Native Land Act. Okay, so 1913 they passed a piece of legislation called the Natives Land Act of 1913. This Land Act basically started off with 7% of the land being available to Africans. 7% of the land. We're talking probably somewhere like 85% of the people. 7% of the land. It went up, they got generous, they felt bad about that, so they made it 13%. And basically, This act, the Native Lands Act, created a system of land tenure that deprived the majority of South African inhabitants of the right to own land outside of the reserves, which had a major socioeconomic repercussion on the African people there. Now we're going to go ahead now to the formation of apartheid, because there's so much to talk about, but we want to get a little bit more into the modern history. Apartheid, that's something we heard a lot about. We got a powerful anti-apartheid movement here in the Bay Area. Excuse me one second. What is apartheid? And what was apartheid, or is it still with us, right? Apartheid was a system of legislated racial oppression, which literally means apartness. It grew out of the requirements of the British mining interests at the end of the 19th century and was formally instituted in 1948. After grabbing the land of the indigenous African population, thereby destroying the basis of their agricultural and pastoral pre-capitalist economy, the colonialists consigned the Africans to the role of migrant laborers, hired only for short-term contracts and forbidden to settle in the vicinity of their jobs. Now, what does this really mean? Okay, you see the little darkened areas? These are the settlements that blacks were assigned to. So you had a Zululand, for instance. You had an area in the Transkei where the Hoxa people lived. The Ndemi people have another settlement. You get a contract, and then I guess you take your wife and your kids and you go get a little apartment. No. Wife and kids stay on the settlement, on arid land that is basically, you can't till anything on it. The males go work in the mines and send remittances home. A fairly miserable existence. They live in hostels, apartments. You're lucky if you get a bed, all right? So this is what fed the class consciousness of this working class. The ANC, the African National Congress, was formed in 1912, and it's kind of interesting that it was composed of African royalty, literally. Guys who were chiefs tended to be the overwhelming majority of the membership of the ANC when it was originally founded. I don't know if Mr. Zuma and company are trying to reincarnate this today, but for sure, that was the start. The ANC really didn't take off, though, until they formed the Youth League in 1944. That's when Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, and others joined the group. Now, there are other liberatory movements in South Africa that I think deserve mention, because my next step is to get into the unions, and you'll see why. I'm thinking of the Pan-Africanist Congress, which was formed around 1959. So what was the Pan-Africanist Congress? In my opinion, it was a left split from the ANC, because they felt the ANC simply wasn't militant enough. They had a little bad luck, because the Pan-Africanist Congress affiliated with China. This is at a time when there was something we used to call the Sino-Soviet split. The Chinese and the Soviet bureaucrats fell out with each other. And China started rattling, talking more militant, etc., etc., and basically went its own way. The Soviet Union played a major role in the development and the maintenance of the South African liberation movement. Because here you know, it's hard to discuss or to explain to you the value that, you know, what the Soviet Union did for the ANC. It's hard to really get it, but you know, just, you can't have a meeting like this without a venue, right? So we want to thank, you know, La Peña for being, well, can you imagine when you're in a situation where you're kicked out of the country, where do you go? What do you do with yourself? How do you survive? How do you keep your leadership together? The Soviet Union played a commendable role in providing material support to the various African liberation movements, but particularly the ANC. Okay. I want to now talk about why I'm going to talk about the unions so much. But just before that, other two liberatory movements that deserve mention is one, we're talking about the non-European unity movement. They deserve mention because actually when the ANC was rather dead and not doing anything in the 40s up to the 50s, the non-European unity movement had this non-collaboration movement, and they were pretty bold and pretty successful in organizing. Once again though, they did not have the outside support that the ANC wound up garnering. And then of course there's the Black Consciousness movement, which when the ANC was banned, outlawed, its leadership exiled and imprisoned, it was the Black Consciousness movement that kept the struggle alive, led by Steve Biko with his famous quote, "The most important weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed." Okay. The centrality of the working class is something that we cannot impress upon you enough. When the struggle was restricted in South Africa, was restricted to residential townships. All right, so you know what a township is? Very often when you have a city like Johannesburg, right, blacks were not allowed to live in those cities. What happened in South Africa is Africans had to carry a pass with them everywhere they went. Whenever it was demanded that you show the pass, you have to show the pass. Kind of like they want to do here, but a lot more serious. A lot more serious. Well, the PAC, that is the Pan-Africanist Congress, decided, no, we don't want, the Africans all resented, you know, they have to have this pass. So they organized a demonstration, you know, in 1960, I think it was, and they took the passes, they started a bonfire, and everybody threw their passes in the bonfire. For this, I don't know if it was 69 people. Around 69 people were gunned down in the fashion that you just saw in the tape that we've just played. This was called the Sharpsville Massacre, one of the more ugly incidents in South Africa. Okay. Now when I talk about the townships, you can't live in the city if you're black. Well, you gotta live, so where you gonna live? You know, how does a maid go to work every day? They formed townships outside of many of the major metropolitan areas. These townships were all black, for the most part. So, outside of Johannesburg, that's where you had Soweto, isn't it? Yeah? So, you know, Soweto was a major township outside of. Talk about this stuff. We're talking about a town with no sewage. Little electricity janked up any kind of way they could get it. Just a miserable situation. Now, it evolved differently over time, but the South African government used to call them locations because blacks didn't deserve neighborhoods. And actually, in 1976, young people going to school, trying to better themselves, were confronted with the problem. the South African government decided that they wanted to make Afrikaners a required language in the country. You had to take Afrikaners when you went to school. Doesn't sound like that big a thing. No thank you. How about no thank you? Is that good enough? Well, they began to organize around this question in South Africa. And these are young people. And this led to the Soweto uprising of 1976. And you know, it's really sad. People don't understand how this thing really unfolded. The Soweto uprising was not, you know, we talking 10 years old, 11, 12 years old. These are the children, the age of the children that were gunned down, arrested, tortured by the South African regime. Many of them left the country to join Incanto Wisizwe at their first opportunity. So when we talk about, when I say the struggle was restricted in the residential townships, it was not much of a threat to South African capitalism, excuse me. In fact, these townships were designed for repression. So when the comrades, as the youthful black anti-apartheid militants in the townships were known, and the students protested, their power was very limited. Not so for the working class. When the workers staged the stayaways, nothing moved in South Africa. And there were quite a few of these stayaways coming up to, you know, the 90s. Between let's say, you know, the late 80s and the 90s, there were quite a few of these stayaways. Basically, they were general strikes. This was the demonstration of the social power which, combined with objective interests, gives the working class the capacity to uproot bourgeois society and to lead humanity into the socialist future. And this was South Africa in the late 80s going into the 90s. What the hell happened? First, let's look at the trade union situation. Early trade unions in South Africa had a very difficult situation here. And we're talking about, you go on strike, there's a very good chance you might just simply be shot dead. But still, they organized a union, a mass union called the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, founded in 1919 in Cape Town by Clement Kadali. Problem with this union, it was a general union. It was almost closer to a political movement. So some people who didn't even have jobs thought, you know, they were still in this union. That's problematic when you actually go out to organize, let's say, a strike, you know, because you can't really strike unless you can stop production. That's the key. Because what is a union but a united front, an economic united front of the working class at the point of production? That's the key. Okay, that union kind of faded. And in 1941, the Council of Non-European Trade Unions was formed. And that union organized relatively successfully and led one major general strike in 1946. The miners' strike grew into a general strike, but was not successful in totally, you know, unseating apartheid. So what you had was, and this is the key, the weakness of these earlier unions. None of the African union movements before the 1970s endured because none could turn worker support into a permanent source of power. In each union generation, workers surrendered their power, whether to a charismatic leader, Clement Kadali, for instance, the law, registered TUC SA unions, that is, sometimes black workers would join a union that was strictly run by whites, couldn't even go to the meetings, or non-workers who sought to lead resistance to apartheid. That is to say, many South African workers have always related to the liberation struggle. But there's a difference between building a union and a liberation movement. They're not the same. So here's some on the origins of the new union. After the suppression of the South African Congress of Trade Unions, this was the union that was affiliated with the ANC. The labor movement went into a period of quiescence for, oh my goodness, more than a decade. Then around 1973, when 2,000 workers in a brickyard won a sizable wage increase after a short strike, that tends to give people encouragement. This sparked a strike in the Frame Group, South Africa's largest textile enterprise. By the end of the month, 6,000 workers were on strike. Now we're talking about a situation where, you know, if you walk down the street, police say, give me the pass. I don't have it, boss. Whack! You know, they start beating on you, wailing on you. This is a brutal society. So for people in those circumstances to go on strike, it takes heart. It ain't like here. It ain't just your job you might lose, your life you might lose, as you see. So, in the next 2 months, more than 60,000 workers have been involved in a variety of strikes in the Durban area. The 1973 strikes, these were spontaneous strikes. The working class, at its core, always wants to fight back, but you need an opening, man. But once that ball get to rolling and that black locomotive started rolling, it was, you know, impressive under these conditions that people would decide to go and fight. Funny little quick story. At one point, the police, you know, they got everybody in the stadium. They said, okay, you went on strike. Okay, all shop stewards, take one step forward. Everybody step back one step. Because they knew you step forward, you get arrested, they do ugly things to your body in the police station. Ain't nobody stepping forward. You kidding me? They knew. Well, these strikes suggested to both South African and foreign-owned firms that it was in their interest. Now dig this, see? Capitalism is not necessarily opposed to trade unions in principle. Think about this. It was in the capitalist interest to make some concessions to workers and to consider legalizing the unions rather than face continuing and unpredictable production interruptions. Because what is it about, after all? They want the money. Yeah, they want to beat you down, but they want the money. Okay? So if they can get a union in there, corrupt it, train it, co-opt it, all right. They've done it before. It's just that in South Africa, that's kind of difficult, man. Look, average South African worker makes about 1/16 the money of a white worker. 1/16. And by the way, it's not like you get a special price for milk or, you know, goods when you go to say, hey, I'm a brother, you know, give me a break. They call the police on your crazy ass. It's the same price for everybody. So we talking some serious poverty and working every day. That's why these people fight so hard. Okay, so they formed something they call the Wynand Commission because they decided that they're gonna have to have some labor legislation and try to allow some of the workers to organize some unions. They wanted to see what would happen, and boy did they. One of the unions that was successful in being formed was called the Metal and Allied Workers Union. And here is where it starts to get interesting. I'll try to summarize it, you know, as best I can. What you had was a mixture of workers with different politics. Some workers with black consciousness. Some workers were pro-ANC. Right? Some workers had different, you know, different proclivities politically. And actually, this started to, you know, in South Africa, people migrate to work. So you got very often 7, 8 different languages going on in one place at one time. And you know, you stop and think about it. They have shop stewards in South Africa that can communicate with everybody. Can you imagine if we could have shop stewards that could at least speak Spanish? But we talking 7 languages, some of these guys. That's commitment. That's a serious attitude towards organizing your workforce. So basically, the Weinhardt Commission said, okay, we'll let you set up a union if you register. Now, well, might as well be honest. Who the hell needs a trade union leadership in exile, right? I mean, trade union is different. When you're doing trade union work, that's day to day. Every day you're looking at the way things go, you're looking at your possibilities. You have to be in place to lead a union. You can't lead no union, no South African union from London, writing denunciatory, you know, apartheid must go from London. You know, I'm serious, you know? So what's happening is SOC2 basically couldn't play a role. And in fact, they said that if you register as a union, that's a betrayal of the union. Then why? Because with the fascists. Look at South Africa in 1973, 4, 5, 80s was not a fascist state. There were certainly fascists in the country, okay? An active fascist group functioning in the country, but the state was just a normal old bourgeois state, just like here. And you know, we got people running around talking about this is a fascist state. Well, there's a consequence for such stupidity. When you don't know what fascism is, how in the hell are you going to fight it when it really comes? Think about it. So basically, that rhetoric, that ultra, you know, militant rhetoric is fascist. Well, the guys that, you know, really wanted a union said, you know what, let's try it. Let's see what happens if we register. So some unions registered, some didn't. You know, they tried different combinations. And next thing you know, the Federation of South African Unions had 35,000 members signed up. So that was one tradition, a pragmatic trade unionism in the face of apartheid terror, I might say. But they made it work. They actually organized the workers, trained their shop stewards, set up real functional organization. On the other hand, you had unions that were loyal to the ANC. They called them Chartist unions. And then, of course, you had the Black Consciousness. They built the Mine Workers Union, okay? The National Union of Mine Workers, the NUM, was built by the Black Consciousness movement. All of these unions came together eventually to form COSATU. But to give you just a flavor of how SOC2, the South African Congress of Trade Unions, that is the Stalinists, got in the way. All right, ain't no other way to talk about it. The people from the trade unions in South Africa wanted to go abroad to learn, you know, so they went to London. I met the COSATU people in London. Very interesting guys. Syndicalists, but very interesting. And certainly they had practical experience, you know? Well, SOC2 thought it was a bad idea for these guys to go abroad, and here's why. They said, direct links stake. That was the thing, was we wanted the workers to have direct links with other workers. And they claimed that South African unions did not need to go abroad because it does us no good to put our organization in jeopardy. And also, they went on to say that, well, these trade unions in the West are class collaborationists. Now, you know, they're right a little bit about the second one, but let me tell you, that's garbage. Look, they simply wanted to have a political monopoly of the working class. But in reality, you can't run your mouth and get that. You have to earn it. You have to lead the workers in combat, and that's how you win the loyalty of the working class. Okay, so I'm doing good, okay. Am I? Ooh. Okay, okay. Well, as I said, those unions came together and they formed COSATU. And I just want to mention one more thing before I run, and that is the direct links stuff actually helped to build the anti-apartheid movement generally. So in 1984, when the South African government arrested CUSA, which was a black consciousness, union, they arrested the leadership. The International Labor Organization, ILO, put out a call for labor boycotts against South Africa. We picked up on it here in the Bay Area. My man Howard Keeler, put the motion forward in Local 10. Next thing you know, what we had was a political strike, which is against the law here. Don't kid yourself. It's against the Taft-Hartley Act. We did it anyway. And we had this political strike in support of the workers in South Africa. It was like a lightning bolt around the world. It reinvigorated the anti-apartheid movement. It encouraged the workers in South Africa themselves to see that they were not alone. It really made an important difference. Well, I'm going to have to stop because I ran out of time, but we will have a section on questions, and I hope, that if you have one, don't be shy. All right, I'm going to stop there. Go ahead, Zach.
Thank you, Gerald. All right, our next speaker is Zachary Levenson. Zach is an Oakland activist and a Ph.D. candidate in sociology at UC Berkeley. He is currently researching state-ordered evictions in post-apartheid South Africa. Zach?
Thanks. So before I get started, I just wanted to show a couple clips from some protests I filmed when I was in South Africa. I just got back at the end of this past March. And these clips are mainly to illustrate what a South African protest looked like. And I'm not saying here that there's, of course, some sort of essence of the South African protest, but they do tend to have a number of things. So you'll see a certain distinctive dance that I'll point out called the Toi Toi. That's sort of a mock spear jabbing dance. You'll see a number of protest songs. And these people that I'm about to show you are a number of, about 85 people who got evicted from social housing, who I met just outside of Durban. They're evicted, their rent was doubled behind their backs over a 2-month period. The landlord refused to produce the lease. It's a pretty common occurrence. So they're all thrown on the street. Private security comes in with machine guns, throws all their furniture out the window in the pouring rain, they lose it all. And so they returned about a week later and tried to occupy the housing complex. And so when I met up with them, this is on the second day of this protest. The first day they were turned away at machine gun point. And here they are before the police arrive. And so you'll notice in this first one, there's a graffiti that they've painted on the walls. One of them that you can just see for a second says, "New tenant, one coffin," meaning any new tenant who moves in, they'll attack. And so in the second video clip I'm going to show, they actually chase off a moving truck that attempts to move in a new tenant. So here's the first one. And these are the evicted tenants. And this is them breaking into the housing complex. You can see the security guards in the background, but before the private security arrives. And in this next video, they're doing an approximation of the dance that's called Toi Toi. You'll get the point. And this is the sort of beat. It comes out of the anti-apartheid movement, but it's still seen at just about every protest today. And this is the video where in the distance you can see the moving truck pull up and they chase it off. And then finally I wanted to play them singing a struggle song. So it's pretty standard to have 1980s anti-apartheid struggle songs, sometimes driving from even earlier at post-apartheid protests. And so here they are singing one of my favorites. You can see the lyrics at the bottom. So the guy's a bit of a perfectionist. It goes on for a while, and he tries to get him to do it in rounds and all kinds of craziness. But so the bulk of what I want to talk about today is about the political terrain of the left in South Africa after apartheid, but really since about 2000, and I'll explain why. And what I want to do in the next 30 minutes is give a kind of topological overview of the field of struggle, describe some of the key organized movements out, some of the non-organized elements. But before I do this, I want to briefly sketch the kind of contours of the transition. So if Gerald talked about everything before '94, I want to talk about what happened after, and talk about the political economy of the transition just a bit. You know, more detailed political economy of the transition, sort of beyond the scope of the talk. But I do want to note a few idiosyncratic things about the nature of the post-apartheid state. So first, I really want to emphasize that for the first 5 or so years after the elections in '94, there weren't really sizable opposition movements. So certainly there were breakaway unions, there were small Trotskyist organizations, most notably one called the Workers' Organization of South Africa, WOSA, that was led by a guy named Neville Alexander who died just last week. You know, there were few, if any, social movements or insurrections at this time, in these first 5 years, that took an open oppositional stance toward the ANC. And for this reason, I want to describe these first 5 years sort of as a honeymoon period, let's say. So, the standard story of the ANC's betrayal, and it's really always portrayed as a narrative of betrayal, goes something like this. So you have this valiant cohort of anti-colonial militants and socialists who come into office in 1994, and right away they begin to implement progressive legislation, strong social welfare state, lay the groundwork for the decommodification of land markets. And this program was generally associated with the ANC's 1994 Reconstruction and Development Program, RDP. And don't worry, I won't bore you too much with various bits of legislation, but this one is key. So, this RDP is said to have been derailed by a right wing within the ANC, including but not limited to Thabo Mbeki, who succeeded Mandela as president, and the former finance minister, Trevor Manuel. But what I want to do is actually argue that this account gives the ANC too much credit. It represents the RDP as something it most certainly was not, which is to say, at the time, and really even today, left forces in the ANC and their allies in the South African Communist Party, which I'll refer to from now on as SACP, constantly pointed to the RDP's 5-year plan. So you have things like million homes for the poorest South Africans, you had redistribution of 30% of the agricultural land, in theory, access to water, sanitation, electricity, universal healthcare, education, the whole game. In practice, however, the ANC, they trumpeted these social provisions without actually delivering. And while they did this, they pushed an incredibly regressive program of privatization and deregulation. It's what an academic named Patrick Bond in Durban has called talk left, walk right. So this isn't to say that the ANC didn't bring anything to the table, far from it. I mean, for example, since '94, the national government's delivered about 2.6 million homes. And I'm focused in particular on housing because this is what I study. But they delivered about 2.6 million homes. And for this, they definitely deserve quite a bit of credit. By some estimates, only really China, the USSR, Indonesia have delivered housing on a comparable scale. But it has to be noted that in 1994, there were about 300 shack settlements in the country. Today, depending what estimates you use, they're between 2,700 and 2,800. That's a 9-fold increase in the number of settlements. And note that most have actually grown in size, despite the ANC's housing delivery program. So somewhere between a quarter and a third of the urban population is living in self-built shacks. So Gerald was talking about the townships, it's awful, they don't have sewage, etc., etc. You'd be shocked how many people are living like that right now. So I could give you similar stats for municipal service access, sanitation, and the like, but you basically get the point. So what is the point? We might think of ANC governed South Africa. It's what I like to think of as a degenerate welfare state, sort of like a degenerate worker state, as some Trotskyists continue to call China. Certainly there are aspects worth defending: entrenched labor unions with real political influence, a few years of decent service delivery, but the overall result is a mess. If inadequate implementation of the welfare provisions of RDP were the only problem, I wouldn't be up here whining. But it was only 2 years later that the ANC pushed through its Growth, Employment and Redistribution Plan, popularly known as GEAR. The plan was such a deviation from anything potentially progressive that it might as well have been ghostwritten by a World Bank economist in the late 80s. Complete with austerity measures, corporate tax cuts, and a single-minded obsession with inflation control, GEAR earned Finance Minister Trevor Manuel the nickname Trevor Thatcher, and prompted Thabo Mbeki to tell the press corps, quote, "Just call me a Thatcherite." Hardly a right turn down the line, this was in 1996, 2 years after Mandela's election. So if this doesn't constitute a naked rejection of the 1955 Freedom Charter, the most important document in ANC history, I don't know what does. Far from an abstract set of prescriptions, the Freedom Charter recommended land redistribution under the slogan, "The land shall be shared among those who work it," and nationalization of the mines, and this is quoting from the Freedom Charter, quote, "The mineral wealth beneath the soil, the banks and monopoly industry shall be transferred to the ownership of the people as a whole." So less than 2 years after his release from prison, Mandela traveled to the World Economic Forum at Davos. Oh, sorry, this is actually the houses that were delivered, the RDP houses, look something like this. But these are actually pretty nice ones. About a third of them are dilapidated and fall apart within a couple years. And this is Mandela at the World Economic Forum. So he comes back from the World Economic Forum a staunch opponent of nationalization, despite the Freedom Charter. He proudly told an interviewer that the RDP includes, quote, "not a word about nationalization." And yet, less than 100 pages into the document, we have the following, and this is a quote from the RDP. "The democratic government must therefore consider increasing the public sector in strategic areas through, for example, nationalization." So, my point in saying all of this is that the rise of neoliberalism in South Africa must not be narrated as some sort of devious plan implemented by a rogue rightist, such as Mbeki. Indeed, key provisions advocating privatization and deregulation and staunch opposition to nationalization and land redistribution became the norm as early as 1992. And I want to make one final point regarding the nature of the South African state after apartheid, before I move on to talk about resistance and ongoing developments in South Africa. So, as I'm sure many of you have heard, the ANC jointly governs with the Communist Party and COSATU, the country's largest trade union confederation, in a peculiar coalition called the Tripartite Alliance. While only the ANC actually runs candidates, the SACP and COSATU hold major influence at the party's national conference every 5 years. This conference is where the ANC picks its next candidate to field in the presidential elections. So the next national conference is going to be held this December in Mangaung, which is Bloemfontein, one of the capitals. And it'll effectively determine the next president of South Africa. COSATU and the SACP, in alliance with members of the ANC Youth League, were absolutely instrumental in bringing Zuma into power, with COSATU General Secretary Zwelithini Mabavi famously declaring that he'd, quote, "shoot and kill for Zuma" at the party's last conference 5 years ago at Polokwane. Less than 2 years later, so in 2009, Mabavi was publicly attacking Zuma for being an enemy of labor and is now one of his foremost antagonists. So while while Zuma is relatively unique in his limited time in the CP for an ANC leader, the overlap between the ANC and SACP leadership is quite striking. So the current General Secretary of SACP, for example, Blade Nzimande, is also Zuma's Secretary of Education. Or to give another example, Secretary General of the ANC, Gwede Mantashe, is simultaneously on the Central Committee and the Politburo of the SACP. And I could go on all day with those kinds of overlaps. So another thing to note is that far from a left force in national politics, the politics of the SACP are even more pernicious than the liberal popular frontism of the CP here in our own country. The key thing to note about the SACP's program is its obsession with what it refers to as the NDR, the National Democratic Revolution. So NDR has been a central tenet, if not the central tenet, of the SACP's platform since its birth as the CPSA in 1921, and it actually gets this from the recommendations made by the Comintern in 1921 and the year before at the Baku conference. And whatever this might have meant under apartheid, today the NDR is a thoroughly reactionary, if not perplexing line. So what it really means in political practice is that prior to the consolidation of a bourgeois democratic state, any ruptural revolution of the type that hopefully those of us in this room would like to see is impossible and basically a waste of time. So before the NDR is consolidated, oppositional organizing, this includes mobilization against privatization. I mean, the CPSA has actually actively come out against mobilization against privatization. And it's dismissed as reactionary, ultra-left, and just about everything in between. I mean, they run the whole gamut in the sort of dismissive epithets. So while in Durban, I actually debated the president of a campus Young Communist League, and I asked him, you know, how in the world is the current South African state not classic bourgeois democracy? I mean, in its sort of archetypal form. And he just kept insisting that it wasn't, that we had to first consolidate the NDR, then we could move on to substantive organizing. And so I asked, well, you know, provide some concrete criteria so we know when the NDR is consolidated and we can move the hell on. And he just kept refusing, saying that any organizing outside of the state at this point is insufficient. Which brings me to the real meat of the talk, which is the question of who is organizing outside of the state. So in the remainder, what I want to do is sketch the contours of resistance in South Africa today. And as I said, you know, the first 5 years were really met with compliance, and I called this earlier honeymoon period. You know, certainly there were revolutionary groups. Some of them even ran against Mandela formally in 1994. But broad-based organizations who openly took an antagonistic stance toward the ANC were pretty unheard of. So these are all the groups I'm gonna cover, just sort of briefly. And I'm gonna try to do this, in addition to doing it quickly, I'm gonna try to periodize these movements in two waves. The first of which starts around 2000, the second of which starts around 2005, 2006. So one of the first groups to emerge doesn't quite fit the paradigm I'm trying to lay out here, because really they enjoy the wholehearted support of COSATU and the SACP. But it's definitely worth mentioning briefly. And this is the Treatment Action Campaign, the TAC, not to be confused with our TAC here in Oakland. It was established in 1998 by the HIV-positive Trotskyist Zaki Ahmed. And this was in direct response to President Thabo Mbeki, who was president at the time, his complete botching of South Africa's AIDS crisis. So just to give a kind of 2-second overview of the AIDS crisis, 18% of South Africans are infected with HIV or AIDS. This makes it the third highest country in the world. The only higher countries are neighboring Swaziland and Botswana. Now, most scholars at this point have reached a consensus that about 365,000 people died, preventable deaths, on Mbeki's watch. And during this time he continued to assert that there's no link whatsoever between HIV and AIDS. The TAC, the Treatment Action Campaign, working with COSATU and the SACP, launched a brilliant PR campaign against Mbeki's mishandling of the crisis, and ultimately in 2001, they won a court battle that guaranteed cheap antiretroviral medication for South Africans. So in addition to taking on Mbeki, they actually had to take on, well, of course, multinational pharmaceutical companies backed by our very own Al Gore. So I do want to note, though, that the Treatment Action Campaign's trajectory is relatively unique in terms of the willingness to work with the organization, effectively rendering it a progressive lobbying organization at best. So certainly it mobilized support among its grassroots constituency, but it never really took a hardline anti-ANC stance. So one of the most hopeful such hardline groups to emerge during this first wave is called the Anti-Privatization Forum, the APF. So the APF was formed in 2000, really as a merger of two groups. So you have a student movement against privatization of the university and in solidarity with laid-off workers at the University of the Witwatersrand. Most people call it Wits University in Johannesburg. You emerge of this student movement with activists who are organizing in parts of Johannesburg and in nearby Soweto against privatization of municipal services, and above all, water and electricity. So you really have a successful integration of students, intellectuals, neighborhoods, unions into this single unit. And it was highly productive for a time. I mean, after a brief lobbying phase in its initial years, it really reemerged as this mass-based civic organization focused on direct action, neighborhood-level organizing, and legal strategy. So it was founded by both Trotskyists, as well as SACP members who were expelled for ultra-leftism. Now that's pretty common. You'd be shocked how many you meet there. The group's greatest success, I think, is this establishment of these local committees that are focused on single issues. So it was instrumental in setting up what remains today called the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee that really had its heyday a few years ago. And it played a key role in legitimizing illegal electricity connections and remained militant for years. And today they actually initiated a campaign called Operation Kanisa, which means Operation Light It Up, where they hook up electricity illegally. So in addition, APF organized massive marches outside of neoliberal summits, and most notably drawing thousands to militant protests outside of the UN's World Summit for Sustainable Development, the WSSD, in Durban in 2002. The ANC and its supporters consistently attempted to tar the APF as a so-called third force, which is a reference to the last days of apartheid, when there were groups attacking both anti-apartheid militants in the ANC and the apartheid state. I mean, most notably Buthelezis in Kata. And you know, around 2008, the APF basically petered out. You know, some of its local incarnations remained active, but as a national level organization, it began to fade. So in addition to the TAC and the APF, I want to talk about one other group that was formed during this period. And this is the Western Cape Anti-Eviction Campaign, which I'll refer to as the AEC. So as its name suggests, it's been at the forefront of organizing against evictions in the Cape Flats, just east of the central business district of Cape Town, as well as militant protests against the privatization of municipal services. So in addition to winning a moratorium on evictions in its first year of existence, the AEC helped organize this 21-month-long occupation against torrid conditions in the Blikkiesdorp transit camp. And this means Tin Can Town, Blikkiesdorp. Because these are, and I'll show you a picture in a sec, but this is effectively people living in these single-room tin shacks in a refugee camp on the periphery of Cape Town. So this was the longest such occupation in South African history. Likewise, the AEC led the campaign against the forced relocation of 20,000 shack residents in the Cape Flats to what amounted to a temporary refugee camp. This is Blikkiesdorp that I was just talking about, in order to make way for this large-scale housing project that the national and provincial governments were trying to implement. It initially promised to actually rehouse these evicted shack dwellers, but less than a quarter of the promised homes were actually constructed, and most of them were actually, those that were constructed, were out of the evictees' price range in any case. So instead, former residents were moved to a transit camp 15 kilometers further from the already peripheral housing to the site past the airport. And just quickly, I want to show a couple videos of protests I attended in Blikkiesdorp. here's one of a road blockade. And all they're doing here is attempting to shut down this major thoroughfare called Symphony Way just to attract the ward councillor to come visit. This guy's been their elected ward councillor for 8 years, but's never actually visited the camp. And here they are, blocking this taxi from getting by. Another car is trying to get by. And then this is their equivalent of a sort of FTP march. This is the anti-land invasion unit, and here they are going by singing just the word police over and over in Isitkosa, and so they just repeat it over and over, taunting the police. So the AEC is technically still active, and when I was in Cape Town, I actually met with a number of its operatives, including some who were in Blikkiesdorp, which is the area I just showed. The problem is that factionalism has really left the group a shadow of its former self, and there are really at least 3 competing leaderships at this point, all clamoring for control of the organization. So certainly Trotskyists have actually played a supportive role in the case of the AEC, most notably Martin Legasic, who I know a number of people here know personally. But the group was unique in its independence from previously constituted political parties. So if you'll note, the earlier groups are all formed by Trotskyists and expelled SACPers. Here you have one of the first politically independent groups. So unlike the TAC and the APF, and this is another key difference, at no point did members of the Tripartite Alliance humor these militants, let alone actually collaborate with them. So by around 2006, this initial upsurge of post-apartheid resistance began to peter out, but it made way for a second wave. So this time around, there'd be no collaboration with the Tripartite Alliance forces whatsoever. And perhaps the best known group among this bunch is called Abaslali Basem Jandolo, which is Zulu for people of the shacks. So like the AEC before them, Abaslali is primarily involved in anti-eviction work. And at least a dozen active branches exist in shack settlements around Durban. So around 2009, there are a few branches that emerged in Cape Town under the name Abaslali Basem Jandolo of the Western Cape. Durban really remains the heart of the organization. So most notably, Abaslali won this 2009 Constitutional Court mandated revision of what was known as the Slums Act. The full name is the KwaZulu-Natal Elimination and Prevention of Reemergence of Slums Act of 2007. And this is legislation that described informal settlements as, quote, a hindrance to housing delivery, and it actually facilitated their eradication. So I spent a couple of months with Abaslali late last year, attending branch meetings with their central leadership. And at one of these meetings, we went to an informal settlement outside of Pinetown, which is a small industrial center just outside of Durban. And there are about 80 people in attendance. Some of the smaller meetings had 20 to 30, but I have to say I was pretty impressed. I mean, there have been a lot of critiques on coming out of the South African left about how Abaslali is sort of a shell of its former self, it's dying out. And I have to say, I was impressed when I attended their branch meetings that they had a minimum of 20 to 30 people, and some of them close to 100. Interestingly enough, at the meeting with 80, this one guy starts running around with a bullhorn calling for an ANC meeting. Every time, one of the guys in the Abaslali Youth League leaned over and told me that every time they try to hold a meeting in this settlement, someone from the ANC will show up, run around with a bullhorn and try to muster up support for a meeting. Can't get a single person. But closely aligned with Abaslali is a group called the Landless People's Movement, an affiliate of Via Campesina. So originally many of the branches were rural, but over the years increasingly a number have become urban, or what I guess you can call peri-urban, which is on the periphery of the city. The group was actually formed in 2001, which put it pretty firmly in this first wave. And like the ANC, it spans, like the AEC, sorry, it spans both waves. So in 2008, in preparation for the national elections, the LPM joined forces with Abashlali and AEC and formed the Poor People's Alliance. The coalition actively rejects electoral politics, mobilizing support under the slogan, "No land, no house, no vote." I met with a few LPM members when I visited Soweto last October, and they showed me how they had rigged up this elaborate system of illegal electricity connections, ultimately connected to this power source between the shacks and the houses that were across the road. Angry homeowners disconnected them repeatedly, and finally the LPM and their supporters marched on the electricity box, and someone burned it to the ground. If we don't get electricity, no one gets electricity, my contact told me. Unfortunately, many LPM branches have largely dissolved at this point, with a Soweto-based branch I visited actually going over to the Democratic Alliance, the DA, in 2010. And the DA is this neoliberal, largely white-dominated party that governs Cape Town and the Western Cape. But it remains an opposition party everywhere else in the country. Apparently the opportunist leader of the group was approached by the DA to run for ward councillor, and so she brought most of her branch with her. To go on to a couple other groups, just briefly, more recently, a group called Unemployed People's Movement formed, the UPM, and they really gained traction in Grahamstown, which is in the Eastern Cape. They remain staunchly critical of the ANC. They've actually debated people in the, on national television. The president of the UPM debated the president of the ANC Youth League. And they now have affiliates in Durban, who are reported to have organized supermarket occupations, where dozens march into corporate grocery stores and actually eat off the shelves in the store until they get arrested. So I could go on, but I just want to mention one or two other key groups before closing. So one is called September National Mbizo, and this is what I see as the country's most promising black nationalist group at this point. And from what I observed, it seems to have a decent following in most major cities. Like the Poor People's Alliance, the SNI is firmly anti-electoralist and often invokes the writings of Steve Biko against the ANC, whose rule they characterize as disastrous. And finally, I want to talk about a group called the Democratic Left Front, the DLF, which is really South Africa's most high-profile attempt at recruitment. So it's formally established in, I think, January of 2011. And it's affiliated with the radical magazine Amandla, which is really the website actually right here. And it's formed as this coalition of Trotskyists, ultra-leftists expelled from the Communist Party, syndicalists, and independents. And it's played a key role in mobilizations against the Secrecy Bill, which is basically the South African equivalent of the Patriot Act, as well as in pushing eco-socialism around the country. So they take a firm defensive eco-socialism line. And it has a presence throughout South Africa, but the DLF's definitely strongest in Cape Town and Johannesburg. So both the DLF and the SNI sent delegations to Marikana immediately following last month's massacre, with the SNI doing especially valuable fact-finding work. I highly recommend that people take a look at Amandla magazine's blog, and you can see some of the SNI reporting, for example, on this blog. This is right here. So going forward, and this is in closing, it's pretty clear that while formally organized groups have played a progressive role, they've yet to effectively harness the class rage whirling through the nation. So as we've seen just recently, rather than be intimidated by the ANC-ordered massacre of their comrades, miners throughout the Platinum Belt and nearby gold mines have continued to organize wildcat strikes. So while the AMCU, this is the Association of Mine Workers and Construction Union, a small union, relatively small union, not affiliated with COSATU. While the AMCU has played a good role, it remains unclear how much of this is opportunism and how much it demonstrates that the union is a militant alternative to the COSATU-affiliated National Union of Mine Workers. In addition to labor unrest, people around the country continue to engage in militant service delivery protests, often met by, and this is when municipal services are inadequately delivered, they call them service delivery protests. These are often met by police firing rubber bullets at close range, and in some cases even fatal fire. So I'm under no illusion here that these protests are themselves a viable path forward, but surely they do demonstrate that the South African working class is among the most frustrated and willing to revolt of any I've ever studied closely. It'll be interesting to see whether these neighborhood-level forces are able to connect with militant migrant laborers and miners over the course of the next year, especially in the face of next week's COSATU conference and the coming ANC conference in Mangaung in December. The South African working class remains unquestionably ripe for a revolt that will fully decolonize the country. The only question is how to translate these sporadic rebellions into a force capable of breaking with the ANC once and for all, the South African equivalent of the Democrats. Thanks.